August 19, 1944. Wehrmacht Headquarters, East Prussia. General Alfred Jodl read the intelligence reports with an almost cynical confidence. For him and his colleagues on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the American lightning advance was not a sign of strength. It was a predictable mistake. Patton's Third Army had outpaced its own logistical capabilities. It was more than 600 kilometers from the ports of disembarkation. No mechanized force could keep up this pace. The math was clear. Bankruptcy was inevitable. And Jodl smiled. That laughter was about to be silenced by a kind of force that German doctrine did not understand. The raw power of mass production. While German generals calculated logistical failures based on their own limitations, 6,000 American trucks were already running day and night in an operation that would redefine the concept of mechanized warfare. This is the story of how the belief in German tactical superiority was crushed by a concept they underestimated: logistics. Not refined logistics, but a noisy, dirty, and efficient industrial avalanche. The Red Ball Express didn't just fuel Patton, it swept away the certainties of a generation of commanders, because in modern warfare, he who moves faster wins. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story, and that perhaps explains why so many German generals lost sleep in September 1944. In just 82 days, 6,000 American trucks crossed the destroyed roads of France, day and night, carrying more than 400,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and supplies. There was no precedent. While the Wehrmacht put 600 tanks on the battlefield, the Americans bet on axles, tarpaulins, and diesel engines. It was a war decided not by armored vehicles but by tires. What the Germans called logistical chaos proved to be a system as efficient as it was ruthless. And as the trains multiplied, the strategic certainties of the German general staff began to crumble, 1 ton at a time. If you value the accuracy, memory, and quiet impact of real history, please support this work with a like and apply. Each gesture helps to keep alive the mission of revealing what the books do not tell, and what the generals did not want to admit. In Berlin, confidence was absolute. The August 1944 reports confirmed what the German generals had already expected to see. The Americans had advanced too fast. Patton was 600 miles beyond his logistical bases, with tanks burning fuel at rates that seemed insane even by American standards. More than 0.5 miles per gallon on the road, much worse on rough terrain. A single armored division required about 1,000 tons of supplies per day. Patton commanded 12. The math wasn't a guess. It was a sentence. The same mistake had been made before, and by the Germans themselves. In the autumn of 1941, during the offensive on Moscow, the Wehrmacht learned that no advance survives without supplies. Jammed trucks, railroads with incompatible gauge, horses killed by exhaustion. The Blitzkrieg had frozen to death, not by Soviet weapons, but by the absence of parts, tires, oil, and gasoline. Now, in 1944, the Americans were advancing at an even more insane pace, and logic dictated that they would also stop. German doctrine, deeply technical, saw progress as an exact equation. The farther away, the more vulnerable, and Patton had already gone too far. For the German general staff, it was enough to wait. But what they didn't know was that as they awaited the American collapse, something very different was being built, and it was moving. The irony began to form in layers. In East Prussia, calculations were based on tested doctrines. The speed was useful only up to the breaking point, and the Americans, the report said, were unaware of this limit. A tank does not win a battle if it is dry. A breakthrough does not sustain morale if soldiers are not fed. The Americans were days, perhaps hours, away from stopping. History itself said so. But there was a hidden error. The German mental model was European. He assumed that every army faces the same shortage, that every logistics line suffers from the same wear and tear, that all combats operate under the same laws. And it was this conceptual misconception that would open the door to the collapse of the German war logic. The brutal truth was hidden in the ports of Normandy, where endless convoys unloaded GMC CCKW trucks in numbers never seen before. By July and August 1944 alone, more than 100,000 trucks had been unloaded in France, more than the total Wehrmacht fleet available for motorized transport across the Western Front. For the general staff, this data seemed impossible, a mistake of intelligence, but it was just the beginning. In 1944, American production of military vehicles was 10 times greater than that of the whole of Germany. In a single month, the United States manufactured more trucks than Germany produced during the entire year of 1943. If this surprises you, comment below with "Logistics wins," because for the German generals this was literally inconceivable. The enemy they were fighting wasn't just an army, it was an entire continent, mobilized like an assembly line. The Germans were betting on Patton's logistical paralysis as the turning point of the campaign, but they weren't fighting against the limits of France. They were fighting against Detroit's manufacturing capacity, and this inability to imagine a war powered by engines rather than horses was the real blind spot of the German general staff. They based their projections on reality itself, and in it, efficiency was everything. Maintain, repair, plan, save. The Americans, on the other hand, operated with a different logic. They didn't fix it, they replaced it. They did not spare, they produced. A broken truck was thrown on the side of the road. Another took his place. No German commander was trained to understand a war where failures were predicted, accounted for and absorbed by redundancy, where waste was not failure, but part of the plan. And while German officers were organizing tables on fuel consumption, tank performance, and maximum advance distance, a supply network was born before their eyes. But it didn't appear on maps. He did not follow doctrine. It could not be measured by the known criteria. It was a living road, made of metal, improvised and of invisible men who together moved more tons a day than any European army had ever dreamed of. On August 25th, the first Red Ball Express trains officially began to circulate. But for the Germans, none of this still made sense. It was noise, disorganized movement, a violation of everything that military science taught. And that's exactly what made the system so devastating. It was not about doing better. It was about doing more, constantly, with volume, with strength, with redundancy. It was like trying to contain a dam with buckets. Field officers reported columns of trucks that crossed the night with headlights on, with no spacing between vehicles, ignoring all basic safety precautions. This was not war. It was disorder. But the disorder, this time, worked. By this time, some generals had begun to doubt their own calculations. The reports kept coming. Patton didn't stop. The tanks continued to advance. The ammunition did not run out. There was no shortage of fuel. And more alarmingly, the American artillery fired with total freedom, without rationing. What the Germans expected to see did not happen. And this generated a new kind of panic, because it meant that the Americans had overcome the equation. They had ignored the manuals, and logic has been defeated. But that was only the first indication. The Red Ball Express had not yet shown its full reach. And when he did, it wasn't the tanks that made the biggest impact. It was the truck's engines rumbling into the night that put fear where there had been calculus before. Because while the Germans were waiting for a break, America was just beginning to accelerate. The German generals did not make a mistake in the numbers. They made mistakes in the world they believed in. On paper, the intelligence reports were correct. Patton was advancing at 20, 30, sometimes 60 kilometers a day, with tanks that consumed thousands of gallons of gasoline in hostile terrain, under heat, mud, and destroyed roads. Each armored vehicle needed fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, and constant coordination with infantry, engineering, and artillery units. German doctrine knew this model profoundly, because it was Germany itself that created it. Blitzkrieg, lightning warfare, was based on speed sustained by mobile supply lines, and Germany knew, more than any other army, that this speed always takes its toll. For this reason, the analyses carried out between July and August 1944 seemed reliable. Each American armored division required between 800 and 1,000 tons of supplies per day. Patton commanded 12. It was an operation that required more than 12,000 tons per day in logistical displacement. Arithmetic was fatal. Even assuming perfect roads, impeccable trucks, and infallible drivers, which was impossible, Americans couldn't keep up that pace for more than 72 hours. That was how the Germans thought, and that was why they smiled. But the error was not in the numbers. It was on the premise. The logic of the German general staff was the European logic, based on scarcity, rationalization, methodical planning. A logic inherited from centuries of wars of attrition, where each kilometer conquered cost weeks of preparation. Germany had reached its military apex with the integration of tanks, motorized infantry and air support, but always within a finite model, which counted fuel as gold and tires as provisions. They designed American logistics on that basis and multiplied their best rates by 3, and yet Americans exceeded that expectation by a factor of 10. This was not a miscalculation. It was a paradigm error. The Germans were not fighting an army. They were fighting against an entire civilization adapted to production. By 1944, the United States had 142 truck factories operating simultaneously. General Motors alone produced more military trucks than the entire German automobile industry combined. Instead of preserving vehicles, the Americans treated them as cartridges. They were used, discarded, replaced. For every engine cast, there were 3 in stock. For each flat tire, another 100 were waiting in the warehouses. The concept of preventive maintenance was replaced by the concept of constant availability. And for every truck destroyed, 2 were unloaded in Cherbourg, ready to run. This model did not exist in German manuals. Germany designed systems based on resource preservation. The United States, by contrast, designed systems based on expected losses. They knew it would break, and they prepared for it. American logistics was an industry on wheels. And more than that, it was a silent ideology. While German generals studied Clausewitz and Schlieffen, American planners studied Henry Ford. The war for them was a matter of rhythm, a flow, a standardized system with tolerance for error and failure. So when trucks started rolling en masse, the impact wasn't just material, it was conceptual. The Germans expected resistance and attrition, but what they saw was a continuous flow, and that for a doctrine based on total control was a greater threat than any weapon. The error of judgment was compounded by the belief in the exhaustion of the enemy. American consumption rates frightened even the Allies themselves. An infantry division required an average of 700 tons of supplies daily, an armored division more than 1,000, and that's just to keep the operation going, not to mention reservations, alternative routes, or losses. The roads were in ruins. The railroads had been demolished, the bridges blown up. There was no indication that the Americans would be able to maintain this effort for more than a few days. It was this belief that fueled German confidence that Patton's advance would soon stop. But they were applying the reasoning of industrial Prussia to the wrong enemy. America was not Prussia. It was Detroit. This underestimation reached even the highest ranks. On August 20th, General C. von Westphal, Chief of Staff of Army Group B, calculated that even with unlimited trucks, which the Americans certainly didn't have, perfect roads, which also didn't exist, and no mechanical failure, which was absurd, Patton's Third Army couldn't maintain its advance for more than 48 hours. What von Westphal did not understand was that the flaw was already in the plan. Red Ball Express would be, by definition, a controlled waste operation, and that was what made her invincible. While the Germans tried to understand why the Third Army did not stop, convoys ran in 20-hour shifts a day. Trucks broke down and were abandoned. Engines melted and were changed on the road. Parts were cannibalized in real time. The doctrine of full enjoyment has been replaced by the doctrine of uninterrupted availability. And while the Germans calculated efficiency, the Americans measured tons. For every German report predicting collapse, the Red Ball Express delivered one more round of ammunition, more fuel, more ration, more tires. This model difference was not only visible in the data, it was felt in the countryside. American soldiers continued to advance. The tanks continued to operate, and the trains did not stop. To the German generals, this made no sense. It was like watching a self-feeding blitzkrieg, without limits, without pauses, without scarcity. It was not the blitz they knew. It was something new, a model of warfare that did not depend on tactical talent, but on working engines. And the engines did not stop. On the night of August 26th, while German maps still predicted American collapse at any moment, a convoy of more than 200 trucks was departing Cherbourg, bound for Patton's forward positions, carrying artillery ammunition, fuel, and rations. It was just the first of dozens that would follow that morning, and none of them would be detained, because the enemy that the Germans hoped to see stop had already passed through them, and what lay ahead would be even more difficult to explain, because if the math didn't add up, the next reports would be even more impossible to ignore. The collapse did not come. Patton's columns did not stop. On the contrary, they accelerated. And when the Allied commanders realized that the traditional supply line was on the verge of collapse, a decision was made. Not a bureaucratic solution, but a total break with the war manuals. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express operation was officially born, an unprecedented initiative, forged in urgency and boldness. Instead of trying to restore standard logistics, with railroads, warehouses, and tiered staggering, the Americans created a living highway, a closed, unidirectional circuit, exclusive for supply trucks. The priority was absolute. No other unit could travel there. Speed was the law. The truck circulated with headlights on at night, ignoring blackout protocols, with armed escort at checkpoints and maintenance in the field. The routes were doubled, one out, one return, and the flow was constant. More than 1,000 trucks per day, in coordinated movement with 20-hour shifts. Most of them were led by young, poorly trained soldiers, many of whom had never seen combat. None of this mattered, because the mission was clear: to keep Patton moving, at any cost. The operation was named after American Express trains, marked with a red sphere indicating top priority. It was an appropriate metaphor. The Red Ball Express did not follow the rules of conventional warfare. He ran them over. There was no room for breaks, strategic planning, or weather forecasts. Every 10 minutes a new convoy entered the route. The space between the trucks was minimal. The vehicles were leaning against each other, many overloaded, some in poor condition. And when they broke down, which was inevitable, they were pushed off the track. The order was simple: never stop. If one truck was hit by an air attack, the others followed. If the driver fainted from exhaustion, another would take over. By the time the tank stopped, it was too late. The convoy had already passed. This brutal speed required more than courage. It required a completely new infrastructure. The Americans set up supply and maintenance stations along the route. Mobile workshops, first aid stations, rest areas, but all at an industrial pace. The average time to refuel a truck, 4 minutes. The maximum downtime for light repairs, 12 minutes. Above that, the truck was abandoned. The doctrine was simple: volume beats precision. Drivers were given basic directions and often hand-drawn maps. There was no radio. Navigation was visual, with improvised signs, beacons, and markings made with white paint on the roads. And even so, the system worked. In 36 hours, the Red Ball Express went from idea to functional operation. And in less than a week, it was already delivering 12,000 tons per day to the advanced units. Patton's blitz was not only sustained, it was accelerated. The boldness of this operation shocked even the American officials themselves. Many of them warned of the risks: accidents, air raids, wear and tear on vehicles, coordination failures. But the command ignored it. The biggest risk was to stop. And stopping meant handing over the pace of the war back to Germany. The logic was industrial, not military. It was better to lose 10% due to failure than to stop 90% due to inertia. This mentality of productive redundancy had been shaped not in the war academies but in the auto factories of the Midwest. And now it moved along French roads like a logistical juggernaut. The German generals did not know what they were up against. To them, what they saw, disorganized convoys, overloaded trucks, inexperienced drivers, seemed like desperation. It wasn't. It was excess, an excess that they could never conceive. While Germany rationed tires, America left them on the side of the road. While Germany counted trucks as strategic resources, the U.S. burned them as ammunition. There was no sense of scarcity. There was scale production. Each broken vehicle was statistically predicted. Each flaw was already in the calculation. And it was this calculation that Germany never managed to make. They did not err because of incompetence. They were wrong by assumption, supposing that the war was still European when it was already American. In the first week of operation, the Red Ball Express used more than 300,000 gallons of gasoline just to transport gasoline, a logistics cycle so aggressive that it seemed absurd. But it worked. Patton received enough fuel to keep his tanks moving without interruption. The artillery was supplied with ammunition at levels never seen before, and frontline soldiers began to notice something new: supplies arriving before they were needed. A war driven by anticipation, not reaction. The traditional strategy was being replaced by something simpler and more devastating: constant speed. The psychological impact of this operation was beginning to appear. The captured German troops reported surprise at the persistence of the American advance. They did not understand how it was possible to keep up that pace with destroyed roads, damaged bridges, and sporadic resistance. The answer was in the wheels. The trucks weren't just vehicles. They were cells of an industrial creature in motion. And when an army starts moving like a factory, the war changes form, because it's no longer about tactics, it's about rhythm, of flow, of continuous acceleration. But the Red Ball Express was still young. And what would come next would not be just a sequence of trains. It would be an apocalyptic vision for the enemy, a line of uninterrupted headlights illuminating the French night, advancing like a pulsating vein of fuel and steel. And by the time the German generals finally understood what they were seeing, it was too late, because the next piece of that gear would put an end to any remaining doubt. The enemy had changed shape. And now, the sound of defeat would come from the roar of the engines. From a hill south of Argenton, a German patrol watched, bewildered, what appeared to be a grotesque mistake by the enemy. Below, cutting through the plain towards the east, an uninterrupted line of trucks followed with their headlights on, without tactical formation, without spacing, exposed to the clear sky of dawn. This violated all the rules of mechanized warfare that German doctrine taught. There was no camouflage, there was no concealment, there was no surprise. It was, in the eyes of the general staff, a logistical suicide in the middle of the battlefield. But the trains did not stop. Every hour, new groups joined the flow. Observers counted up to 1,000 moving vehicles per hour, an average higher than what any European army had been able to mobilize, even in offensives planned for months. It was like watching an assembly line cross France. For the Germans, it was insane. For Americans, it was Tuesday. Prussian doctrine had shaped generations of officers based on 3 pillars: discipline, secrecy, and efficiency. Nothing in the Red Ball Express obeyed these principles. The trucks operated at maximum speed, with no protocols of silence, with high beams illuminating the roads at night, an invitation to bombing. And yet, there was no collapse. The trains advanced, delivered, returned, and others came. The system not only resisted its own risk, it seemed fueled by it. The Americans were violating the manuals that the Germans held sacred, and winning. The impact of this on intelligence reports was devastating. A major in the 5th Panzer Army even wrote, "We are no longer fighting an army, but an industrial phenomenon." The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. It was visible, countable, photographable, but what the Germans saw, they could not understand, because it didn't feel like war. It was something closer to a mechanized parade, a display of quantity without tactical logic. But it was precisely this raw abundance that kept Patton moving. While the Germans planned surgical disruptions in the enemy rear, the Americans already had replacements ready for each loss. For every truck hit, 2 took their place. For each section bombed, engineers from the Transportation Corps built detours in record time. German resistance was not ignored. It was statistically absorbed. Luftwaffe reports recorded attempts to attack the convoys. The German aviation, weakened and without air supremacy, launched sporadic sorties against the columns. But the targets multiplied in such numbers that the damage was diluted. Bombings that, under normal conditions, would paralyze a logistical operation for days, caused only a delay of minutes. The pace did not slow down. The loss of vehicles was expected. The schedule did not include contingencies. It included redundancy. This was the new doctrine that the German generals could not accept: waste as a strategic advantage. And this concept was as perplexing as it was unbeatable. If you're enjoying unraveling these forgotten facts and hidden ironies of military history, show your support, like and subscribe so we can continue to bring you detailed content like this. Because behind every tank is a truck, and behind every victory, an invisible supply line that deserved to be remembered. The sight of the columns would become commonplace. Throughout September, German reports began to cite the lights of the American night, a reference to the headlights of convoys that could be seen from up to 20 kilometers away. What seemed like a mistake, driving with headlights on in a combat zone, was actually a show of force, a kind of moral bombardment. Each beacon illuminated the certainty that the enemy rear guard was not only working, it was advancing, and the sound that came with it was equally disturbing. The constant roar of GMC CCKW engines, which seemed not to cease even to breathe. What the Germans saw from the hill was not just a convoy. It was the silent end of the war they had learned to fight, It was the concrete visualization of what it meant to fight against a mobilized economy and not against an armed force. And when the first prisoners began to report that inexperienced drivers were traveling more than 500 kilometers a day, sleeping little, eating poorly, driving under fire, non-stop, the perception changed. It was not disorganization. It was another order, an order where volume replaced discipline, where abundance covered precision, and where the error, instead of being avoided, was simply diluted into such large numbers that it became irrelevant. And this new model, still misunderstood, was just beginning to show its reach. Because if the Germans could no longer stop the convoys, what would they say when they found out who the drivers were behind this whole operation? The answer would follow, and it would bring with it another, even more disconcerting historical irony. Because the men who moved this gear were, to many within the American army itself, as invisible as they were to the enemies. And yet, they drove with courage, exhaustion, and purpose. While Germany counted tanks, the United States bet on men, anonymous, forgotten, but absolutely decisive. On the hard seat of the Red Ball Express trucks, the war had another sound. It was the continuous roar of engines in forced gear, the dry crackling of worn tires and, at times, the muffled singing of voices that tried to ward off sleep. But there was no glory, no gala uniforms, no certainty of medals. The men who ran these convoys were, for the most part, invisible to the manuals, the press, and even to their own generals. About 75% of them were African Americans, segregated soldiers, often prohibited from carrying weapons in combat, confined to rearguard duties. But it was precisely this rearguard that now moved the front. These men, considered inferior by a racist army and an enemy obsessed with racial purity, were winning the war with their hands on the wheel. And every mile traveled was a living refutation of Nazi ideology. They drove without rest. Some made as many as 4 round trips a day, crossing bombing zones, minefields, ruined villages, and makeshift trails in the mud. Many had no maps. They followed improvised signs or the taillights of the truck in front. When there was fog, it was by the smell of the exhaust that they were guided. And when a vehicle broke down, the engine turned off became a bed, shelter, and workshop. They slept next to the grease. They ate cold canned goods, and they wrote their own slogans on the windshield. Hell on wheels. Keep 'em rolling. Speed means victory. It was a culture of resistance within the resistance, and even without knowing it, they were at the center of the most decisive gear of the campaign. The risks were constant. Broken trucks couldn't be left on the road, but they couldn't stop the flow either. The solution? Abandon them on the shore and move on. A driver who hesitated was run over by the column that came behind. Accidents were common. Attacks, too. Luftwaffe planes occasionally appeared in the sky, firing over the road. But the trains continued. No armored escort. No air support. Just faith, exhaustion, and the awareness that what they carried was vital. Each gallon of fuel delivered could move a tank, save a platoon, conquer a city. And they knew it. The irony was in every detail. While German officers still dreamed of a racially pure war, it was African American soldiers, second-class citizens in their own country, who sustained the army that defeated them. Every mile traveled by these men was a practical denial of the Aryan theory of superiority. They didn't just drive, they challenged. With the engine, with the wheel, with fatigue, with each ton delivered, with each death avoided, these men wrote a line that would never appear in the official books. But it changed the course of the war. Many of them had little or no military training. They were young people of 18, 19 years old. Some came directly from rural areas of the southern United States, others from the industrial streets of Chicago, Detroit, or Philadelphia. They had different accents, different religions, similar fears, but the same goal, to move forward. And moving forward for them was more than a mission. It was an affirmation of existence, of capacity, of value. Therefore, when statistics indicate that more than 412,000 tons were delivered between August and November 1944, one should not imagine an impersonal system. One must imagine hands dirty with oil, eyes half closed from sleep, and feet injured on iron pedals. One must imagine these men. Some died without knowing the size of what they did, buried next to their trucks without honors. Others survived only to return to a country that still treated them as invisible. But the road they built, that one was never erased. Because behind every successful blitz there is a trail of sweat that does not appear on the map, And behind every victory there are names that are not on the monuments but that were there, accelerating, even when the whole world seemed to discredit them. And perhaps the greatest symbol of this contradiction is the silence in which all this happened. The men of the Red Ball Express had no radio, no headlines, no cameras. But they had what no general could manufacture: perseverance. And this perseverance, multiplied by thousands of drivers, overcame time, fatigue, prejudice, and the calculations of the enemy. Because if the Third Army advanced without stopping, it was because they did not stop. If Patton was fast, it was because they were tireless. And if the German doctrine collapsed, it was because reality trampled on theory with the weight of each delivery made under the noise of the engine. But the numbers will still surprise, because what these truck drivers sustained was not just an offensive, it was a complete transformation of American war doctrine. And in the next part, this transformation will begin to show up, not in command orders, but in road bends. Because what the Germans didn't see from the top of the hill was that behind every truck came something even greater, the very redefinition of mechanized warfare. The German maps could not keep up. The arrows representing the advance of the Third Army were redrawn each day, stretched to the edge of the paper. Patton didn't just keep moving, he multiplied it. Armored divisions covered 60 kilometers in a single day, doubling the historical average of mechanized campaigns. By comparison, the German blitzkrieg itself, celebrated as the pinnacle of mobile warfare, rarely exceeded 30 kilometers a day, and this under ideal conditions, with air superiority and planned roads. Now the Americans were doing twice that with unpredictable terrain, sparse German resistance, and supply lines that, by all known logic, should have been broken. But they weren't, because the Red Ball Express had turned logic into brute force. The pace of the advance was no longer dictated by infantry or artillery. It was dictated by supply. If the fuel arrived, the tanks moved. If the ammunition came, the cannons fired. And if the food was delivered, the men continued. This equation, simple and brutal, dismantled the German doctrine of war. What was once a predictable battlefield, where time, weather, and distance imposed limits, was now a race against an enemy that seemed to ignore its own friction. The Third Army was no longer expecting anything. The tanks were filled even before they stopped. The command posts moved daily, and in many cases American radio operators didn't even use encryption anymore. Speed had made codes obsolete. They knew that even if the Germans intercepted the transmission, they would not be able to react in time. The offensive was faster than the enemy's ability to respond. And that, for an army that prided itself on operational precision, was an ideological collapse. Battles are no longer decided by the fighting force. They were decided by the continuity of the flow. When fuel arrived before resistance, victory was almost inevitable. When the ammunition passed the obstacles, the artillery made its way. And when rations came along with reinforcements, morale remained high even in hostile territories. The Germans, stuck in a model where each advance required calculation, preparation, and slow replenishment, began to fight against time and to lose, because it was no longer a question of numerical or tactical superiority. It was about speed, and speed in that scenario meant control of the future. American logistics had become an independent weapon of war. While the German generals sought to understand Patton's next move, he was already 3 cities ahead. Enemy planners tried to estimate the next viable line of defense, and found that it had already been overcome. There was a constant lag between prediction and reality, and this delay was fatal. It was like fighting blindfolded against an enemy moving in the light. In September, a German reconnaissance division found a newly abandoned American base that was still boiling with the heat of the engines. The Americans had left hours earlier, and the battlefront was already 40 kilometers away. Nothing symbolized the new rhythm more than this. Not even the ground cooled before the advance began again. For many German soldiers, the war took a turn without warning. It was no longer confrontation. It became persecution. The American rear became the front, and trucks, not tanks, were now the vectors of advancement. This deconstructed not only the enemy's strategy, but also its identity. Germany had defined itself by its disciplined, precise, ingenious war machine. Now she found herself cornered by an army that seemed improvised, disorganized, chaotic, but on the field it was unstoppable, because what the Germans called disorganization was, in fact, volume, and what they called waste was, in fact, operating margin. The Red Ball Express had broken the calculations. Literally. At one point in the campaign, German logistics officials disrupted the mathematical models for forecasting American consumption and displacement. The data no longer made sense. The volume of supplies delivered, the frequency of the columns, and the speed of the advances were out of the curve. It was not possible, according to his parameters, to sustain this pace for more than a week. And now the operation was already entering the second month, with signs of growth. In just 3 weeks, the Red Ball Express had transported more than 100,000 tons of supplies, an average of almost 5,000 per day. That was more than the entire French army of 1940 had achieved in 3 months. It was more than what Germany could dream of transporting on its own territory, and the Americans did it on hostile soil, with destroyed roads and a moving army. It was war as an industrial process, not as a military campaign. On the front, the difference was tangible. American soldiers began to operate with an almost mechanical confidence. They knew that at the end of the day there would be supplies. They knew that, even wounded or en route, fuel would come. The heavy artillery fired freely. Ammunition was not rationed. Engineers rebuilt bridges in less than 24 hours. It was as if the army operated in a parallel reality, where physical boundaries had been lifted, and the Germans felt it. In intercepted letters, German soldiers reported the feeling of being pushed by an invisible wall. They didn't see the trucks, but they knew they were coming, and that wall had not yet reached its critical mass. Because behind the scenes of the operation, American officials were already planning the duplication of routes, the use of specialized vehicles, and integration with new railroads. The offensive would not only continue, it would gain new momentum. And while the Germans desperately sought a way to stop Patton, the United States prepared the next leap. A leap so big that it would not be measured in kilometers, but in tons. Because now, the weight of war was on the side of those who knew how to carry it. And what lay ahead would make this even more evident. The German reports began to take on a tone of bewilderment. The descriptions ceased to be purely strategic and became almost psychological. They waste everything, wrote an Abwehr officer, noting the American movement north of Chartres. They throw fuel on the ground, abandon entire vehicles, build bridges with improvised beams and pieces of destroyed houses. There is no method, there is no discipline, and yet, win. The war that the Germans knew, the war of precision, of economy of resources, of operational elegance, was not the one that was being fought there. What they witnessed on French roads was a rough, disorganized, almost childlike version of combat, and that version was crushing them. The disconnect was cultural. German military doctrine came from a tradition that valued surgical efficiency. Every move calculated, every piece fitted, every action with minimal loss. It was the Prussian heritage applied to the mechanized era. The Americans, on the other hand, operated under a different logic. The logic of the factory, mass production, from volume over precision. The error was predicted, absorbed, swallowed by redundancy. A broken truck wasn't a problem. It was a statistic. A delayed train did not compromise the operation. Another would follow. Chaos was not an obstacle. It was part of the system. And this was inconceivable to German planners. Wehrmacht engineers were horrified by what they called American bricolage. Improvised bridges with bus bodies, temporary roads made with barn boards, workshops set up in bombed churches. They had been trained to execute perfect maneuvers within strict parameters. The Americans seemed to be playing war, until their bridges worked, their roads held their weight, and their columns passed. It was the triumph of adaptation over doctrine, of improvisation over elegance, and on the field the result was indisputable. At this point in the campaign, U.S. losses in logistics vehicles were already in excess of 1,500. Broken, abandoned, destroyed. For any European army, it would be a disaster. For the United States, it was a Tuesday. Domestic production compensated. By September 1944, the Detroit, Cleveland, and St. Louis plants alone combined were producing more than 2,500 trucks a week. That's right. In 7 days, Americans manufactured more than they lost in a month of war. American truck production in 1944 was more than 15 times that of Germany. To the Germans, each vehicle was a jewel. For Americans, it was a spare part. If this number surprised you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because that's exactly what history was showing. Frustration among Germans was growing, An SS colonel even stated that the Americans fight as if they were setting up a construction site, and in a way they were, but a flower bed that moved, adapted, and survived. German rigor, which required perfect planning before action, had no answer to American flexibility. At many points on the front, the advance did not stop because the terrain did not allow it. He continued in spite of this. Where the maps indicated mud, the Americans passed by with planks. Where there were destroyed bridges, they launched mobile ramps. Where the Germans were waiting for a break to regroup, they found more speed. And this speed did not come from the command. It came from the base, from the drivers, from the engineers, of the sergeants with sledgehammers, ropes, and welders. It was an army that improvised, and that made it unpredictable. What the German generals didn't understand was that they were fighting a nation that had already practiced this kind of warfare, only in the factories. American industry was made up of constant corrections, of predicted failures, from inline substitutions. Every Ford car, every GE refrigerator, every John Deere tractor was the result of processes that didn't require perfection. They required efficiency. This culture had been transplanted into war, and now she drove tanks, built bridges, and fueled fleets in real time. Victory was not in the orders of the high command. It was in the trucker's manual, in the mechanic's toolkit, in the stubbornness of the soldiers. War, for Americans, was not a chess game. It was an assembly line with a final destination in Berlin, and as much as the Germans tried to intercept the next step, production was already advanced. What they saw in the field was just the tip of a much larger gear, spinning endlessly. And slowly, German perception began to change. They were not losing only to an army. They were being buried by an idea, the idea that power didn't have to be elegant. It was enough to be constant. In October, German high command officers began to report a troubling pattern. The Americans were improvising more, risking more, and getting it right. This, for a mindset based on absolute control, was a philosophical breakdown. If improvisation could beat precision, what else was wrong? If chaos could sustain an offensive, what was left of German military science? The enemy did not follow the manuals, and so perhaps he was rewriting them. But the ultimate lesson was yet to come, because what the Germans didn't know was that behind all this noisy makeshift structure there was a coordination system that was as bold as it was secretive, a mechanism that not only distributed supplies, but predicted, tracked, and anticipated them with an accuracy that no European model imagined possible. And this gear, silent but decisive, is about to be revealed. In the cold dawn of September 28, 1944, a German patrol ambushed an American convoy at the height of the secondary route near Evrecy. The attack was coordinated, with a high position, concentrated fire, and enough weaponry to destroy the vanguard of the column. In any other army, that choke point would have been fatal, but on the Red Ball Express there was no end of the line. While the first explosions still echoed on the road, new trucks appeared in the distance, without hesitation, forcing their way like a river that refuses to change course. The Germans no longer faced a logistical system. They were facing a phenomenon of continuous flow, unpredictable and impossible to stop. Tanks did not lead the war, they were carried by it. And this war flowed on thousands of axes, fueled by exhausted men, makeshift maps, and a doctrine that did not wait for permission to function. The metaphor became inevitable. The Red Ball Express was a river, and rivers do not face each other with trenches. The Germans tried to dam it with bombing raids, but there were no fixed targets, no distribution center, no visible warehouse, no idle base. The trucks were mobile depots, coordinated on the move, supplying troops on the move. They tried to divert it with sabotage and mines, but American engineers simply rebuilt the bed with slats, improvised concrete, and even local stones. The Red Ball adapted to the terrain like water. It went around obstacles, infiltrated through crevasses, flowed through new routes in a matter of hours. They tried to imitate it with local logistical efforts, but they ran into a lack of fuel, doctrinal rigidity, and above all, the absence of an industry capable of sustaining the waste necessary for that type of war. This was the point that most confused German planners. For the Red Ball Express to work, it had to accept the loss. Trucks broke down, parts were coming loose, men slept at the wheel, but all of this was absorbed by the scale of the system. The failure, far from being an exception, was statistical. Redundancy covered the error. The flow didn't stop, and that was the only thing that mattered. No European army had ever conceived of this philosophy. For generals trained at the Berlin War Academy, accuracy was the ultimate goal. For Americans, delivery was, even if dirty, even if costly, even if 20 trucks were lost for 80 to pass, the victory was in the volume, and the volume in motion became a strategy. As the American advance extended, German intelligence records changed tone. They left technical skepticism and entered into an almost resigned perplexity. A report dated October 5th declared that the American rear no longer operates as a support. It sets the pace of the front. It was the recognition, albeit belated, that the war had changed its nature, and that tactical supremacy, if not sustained by fuel, ammunition, and food, became only an expensive illusion. Panzer Lehr tanks, famous for their precision and power, began to be abandoned, not because of destruction, but because of lack of diesel. Meanwhile, the Sherman tanks, lighter, less armored, but always full, were advancing. The enemy had built a system where victory depended not on the commander, but on the flow, where the strategy was supported by grease, sweat, and relay, and where the front line was only the visible part of a much deeper, underground, unbroken current. The Red Ball Express was not a support. It was the lifeline. It was the very blood of the army on the move. And as much as the Germans aimed at the muscle, they couldn't cut the artery. The definitive proof of this philosophical collapse would come in a dry sentence, found in the diary of a captured German officer in Metz. We thought that the tanks would crush us, but it was the trucks. This sentence, written without emotion, summed up what the Nazi high command had not yet dared to admit out loud. They were being defeated not by tactics, nor by courage, but by logistics, for a flow of supplies that could not be stopped, by a river that overflowed over their positions, buried their reserves, and erased their escape routes. A river of engines, axles, and men driving in the darkness. But even this river did not flow alone, because behind the scenes of this movement, there was a control system as bold as it was invisible, something that allowed you to predict consumption before it emerged, anticipate failures before they occurred, and adjust course before there was a delay, a system that turned improvisation into science. And now, hidden under tons of maps, statistics, and blackboards, it was starting to operate at full capacity. His name? I wasn't on the field. He was in charge. And its impact, as we will see below, was as decisive as any armored vehicle on the front line. At the underground command center in Zosen, south of Berlin, the phones kept ringing. The reports coming in from the Western Front did not match any forecast. Aerial photographs, radio intercepts, patrol witnesses, all pointed to a pattern that German manuals did not explain. In one of the images captured by a reconnaissance plane, a line of American trucks stretched for more than 20 continuous kilometers, crossing temporary bridges, skirting villages, and forming what looked like a living, ever-moving metallic snake. It was the Red Ball Express. But what most alarmed the German general staff was not just the volume, it was the frequency. The trains just didn't stop. Every night, new deposits appeared in places where the day before, there was only rubble. Every morning, destroyed bridges reappeared, rebuilt with local wood, repurposed steel, or even abandoned vehicle chassis. The enemy seemed to operate with a new kind of mathematics. Walter Warlimont, deputy head of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, was one of the first to realize what was in front of them. It was not a simple American efficiency. It was a structural transformation of the war. The Americans had eliminated time as an obstacle, and now they were beginning to eliminate the distance. What military doctrine taught about escalation, about refueling times, about the natural pause after an offensive, had become irrelevant. The Red Ball Express bent logistical laws that the Germans themselves helped formulate. Warlimont looked at his maps and realized that the supply symbols which had previously advanced behind the combat divisions now preceded them. It was as if the trail of the American offensive was being anticipated, not followed. And that, in technical terms, was impossible, but it was happening. Model, the good soldier of Hitler, also began to question his premises. The field marshal was known for his tactical brutality and for his almost fanatical belief in offensive maneuvering as a solution to any crisis. But even he was forced to admit that something had changed. In one of his dispatches, he wrote, "They do not back down, they do not stagnate, and they don't wait. They attack before we can react. They attack where there is no road." The panic was not verbalized. but it was in the eyes of the officers gathered in the stuffy rooms of the command bunker. A Luftwaffe general, upon seeing the number of American fuel depots springing up along the Le Mans-Paris route, muttered, "It's as if the ground generates gasoline." The Germans knew the complexity behind moving an armored division. They themselves had pioneered this. They knew how many tons a day were needed to maintain an advance, how many trucks, how many drivers, how many warehouses, how many intermediaries. They knew above all that this system was fragile. All it took was a destroyed bridge, a delay in refueling, a mistake in the route, and everything stopped. That was how they had beaten the French. This is how they intended to contain the Russians. But now they saw, appalled, a system that seemed to ignore these breaking points. The Red Ball Express was not a military corps. It was a system of redundancies, and that made him virtually immune to isolated failures. Like a living organism, it adapted, and he continued. At that point in the campaign, the Americans had already delivered more than 300,000 tons of supplies by truck in just 6 weeks. This was the equivalent of what the Third Reich had managed to move by train to the Eastern Front throughout the Stalingrad campaign. The Germans were not only being outclassed, they were being humiliated, because what they thought was their trump card, the technical mastery of mechanized warfare, was now their greatest limitation. They had designed war like a chessboard, where each piece has a precise, controlled, and predictable move. The Americans had brought a juggernaut to the match. Even more serious, the German generals began to realize that there was no way to replicate this system, neither with improvisation, nor with brutality, nor with Hitler's direct order, because the Red Ball Express wasn't just the product of planning, it was the product of an entire civilization. It was born in the factories of Chicago, in the ports of New York, in the training camps of Georgia, in the parts depots of Pennsylvania. It was the sum of thousands of logistical, economic, and industrial decisions made long before the first tank crossed the Rhine. And now this invisible machine was slowly crushing German doctrine. In closed meetings, the most experienced military advisors began to suggest what had hitherto been taboo. The war in the West was becoming untenable, and not for lack of soldiers, but due to lack of time, due to lack of fuel, for lack of road, for lack of response. It was no longer a question of courage or will. It was a matter of calculation, and the numbers were against them. It was in this context that a new proposal emerged in the German command. If they could not stop the flow, perhaps they could cut it off at the source, bomb the routes, sabotage the deposits, kill the river at the source. But, as they would soon see, even this plan carried an invisible trap, because the Red Ball Express, in addition to being mobile, was replaceable, and the Americans were about to show how even their routes could be reinvented overnight. The war for the Americans did not start on the beaches of Normandy. It started on the assembly lines. It began in the dry sound of Ford's hydraulic hammer, the steam of U.S. Steel's furnaces, the synchronized roar of 200 engines tested per hour in General Motors hangars. While the Third Reich fought for every hand-assembled tank, hidden under hastily dug caverns to evade Allied bombing, the United States operated in another time, a time marked by the cycle of mass production. In Detroit, every GMC CCKW truck that rolled off the assembly line wasn't just a vehicle. He was a combatant. Each of them was one more axis in front, an extra gallon on Patton's tanks, one more argument against German technological supremacy. Germany was betting on perfect weapons, America, insufficient arms. While the Germans turned salt mines and underground factories into storehouses of hope, the Americans produced nearly 500,000 trucks during the war, an average of more than 1,000 a day. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. Instead of wasting time repairing damaged vehicles, the American system preferred to replace them. The parts were interchangeable. The bolt of a GMC in Metz fit the same model in Liège or in Bastogne. Maintenance was standardized. Logistics, modular. That meant that a train stopped by mechanical failure was back on the road in hours, not days. It was the first time that the war incorporated the logic of replacement, and that turned every American mechanic into a force multiplier. Germany, on the other hand, was hostage to its own perfectionism. Their tanks were masterpieces of engineering. The Tiger, Panther, and Elephant were feared for their armor, accuracy, and firepower, but they were fragile in what really mattered in a war of attrition: scale. A broken Tiger required specific parts, rare tools, and trained engineers. Often, a vehicle stopped for minor damage was simply abandoned, because the logistical effort to recover it was greater than the cost of losing it. German doctrine valued excellence, but excellence alone does not hold a supply line, and in occupied France this was clear. The militarization of American industry had turned factories into fortresses. Goodyear didn't just make tires, it produced tracks, tank components, truck cables. Firestone did more than rubber. It made repair kits, brake shoes, and even helmets. Singer, famous for sewing machines, manufactured rifle parts and pump components. Each company was a battalion, each assembly line, an invisible division. And the most impressive thing, this industrial army did not sleep. It operated in 3 shifts. Civilian workers, many of them women, maintained production even when the front seemed far away. And when the front approached, the fruits of that production were ready, stacked, labeled, shipped onto trains, ships, and finally trucks. American standardization was the antithesis of the German tradition. While Hitler's engineers created specific models for each situation, elite rifles, specialized reconnaissance vehicles, ammunition of different calibers, the Americans reduced the war to repeatable blocks. The same model of truck could be used to transport troops, load ammunition, medical evacuation, or even improvised shelter. The tires were the same, the headlights the same. The ignition key is identical. This reduced the training required. It increased the speed of replacement. And more importantly, it created a system where each piece could be exchanged for another without compromising the whole. The Red Ball Express wasn't just powered by trucks. It was powered by a philosophy of modularity. For German officers who began to understand this system, the feeling was one of helplessness. One of them, captured in Belgium, stated, "We were fighting soldiers. Now I see that we were fighting against factories." The phrase, spoken bitterly, revealed a reality that the Nazi high command had taken too long to accept. The war had ceased to be a duel of armies. It was now a competition between productive systems. And in this field, Germany was not only at a disadvantage, it was doomed. The consequences were visible on the front lines. An American platoon that lost 2 trucks received 3 the next day. A train that had blown tires swapped entire wheels with stopped units. A battalion advancing too fast had fuel waiting at the next crossroads, delivered by drivers who had never set foot on the front. The system was so efficient that, in some cases, ammunition was delivered even before the official orders reached the command. That wasn't luck. It was prediction based on rudimentary algorithms, manual statistics, and operators trained to interpret motion as a mathematical function. The Germans watched all this without being able to respond. His doctrine did not allow this type of adaptation. His generals had no room for structural improvisation, and its industry, bombed, disjointed and starved of raw materials, could no longer sustain even the fronts that had not yet collapsed. Tank warfare was being decided by who produced the most tires, the war of position for who could deliver hot food, the war of doctrines by those who understood that perfection is the enemy of repetition. And the Americans were winning that war with the regularity of an industrial clock. But perhaps the biggest shock was yet to come, because as powerful as this logistics machine was, it had a central command, a group of officers and planners who operated behind the lines, monitoring every ton delivered, every truck moving, every bayonet distributed. It was the brain behind the flow, the human algorithm that transformed improvisation into pattern and chaos into efficiency. And this brain, as we will see below, was about to redefine what it meant to coordinate an all-out war. While the United States moved mountains of steel and rubber across the bombed-out roads of France, Germany moved with horses. Literally. In the midst of the engine and blitzkrieg era, more than 70% of the Wehrmacht's land logistics still depended on animal traction. It was an image that the German officers themselves avoided admitting, armored divisions being supplied by wagons. While the Americans burned on average 300,000 gallons of gasoline a day just to transport gasoline, a logistical paradox that only a power of abundance could afford, the Panzer Divisionen were in many cases paid less than that per week for the entire combat operation. Shortages began to erode not only the performance but the very morale of the troops. The German doctrine of efficiency, so celebrated in the previous decade, now became a fatal trap. A system designed to work perfectly does not survive when the basic input is failure. The consequences were visible on each movement map. while the Americans advanced up to 80 km per day with the uninterrupted support of the Red Ball Express. Many German units were stopped for days due to lack of fuel, and it wasn't a lack of planning, it was a lack of raw materials. Germany no longer dominated Romania's oil fields. Access to synthetic oil was limited. Allied bombing raids systematically destroyed refineries, and rail distribution, once efficient, was now torn apart by sabotage, civil resistance, and air raids. The Reich's war machine, which depended on precision, was now faced with an unpredictable, gasoline-fueled world. Meanwhile, the Americans carried not only their fuel, but the very pace of the war. Each Red Ball Express train was, in effect, a mobile production line. It carried not only supplies, but predictability. Maintenance was done in transit. Failures were foreseen and covered by redundancy. Scarcity was not a factor, because the very logic of consumption was sustained by excess. The U.S. could make mistakes. Germany does not. And in this imbalance, defeat was already written. It is at this point that it is worth pausing. A single number is enough to measure the abyss. In 1944, the U.S. produced more than 600,000 military vehicles. Germany, less than 80,000. The difference is not only quantitative, it is structural, it is civilizational. If this comparison impressed you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because that's exactly what happened. A victory defined not by aim, but by scale. In practice, this disparity translated into absurd scenes. At the Ardennes, American patrol reports found German armor completely intact but abandoned for lack of fuel. In Nancy, a panzer unit attempted to refuel with gasoline manually extracted from civilian vehicles. In Metz, entire warehouses were left behind because the trucks assigned to retrieve the supplies never arrived. The German war had turned into a struggle against its own absence, against emptiness, against waiting. Shortages also affected artillery. While the Americans could fire at will, and often did, adopting saturation bombing with complete confidence in replacement, the Germans limited their shots by the hour. Field artillery officers were given quotas of ammunition per day and were often forced to choose between priority targets. This was not doctrine, it was despair. The same was true of the Marines. The average number of shots per German soldier was lower than that of his adversaries, not because of fire discipline, but because of real limitation of ammunition. Every shot was a strategic decision. The scarcity undermined not only combat capability, but the very concept of offensive. Modern warfare requires mobility, and mobility requires fuel. Without him, the German doctrine of lightning war became a caricature. Powerful, impeccably engineered tanks unable to walk. Disciplined troops, trapped in defensive positions for lack of traction. Experienced pilots with modern aircraft but no kerosene to take off. The collapse wasn't just military, it was energetic. In contrast, the Americans burned fuel with almost indifference. The cost of transportation often exceeded the value of what was transported, and this was accepted, because the logic was saturation, not economy. The American system was designed to support waste, because that waste was the price of agility, a price they could afford. Total war, contrary to what many thought, was not won by those who saved. It was won by those who could spend. The Germans, trapped in the logic of precision, could not understand this. Their war machine demanded control. It required balance. But the battlefield of 1944 no longer allowed for balance. It was chaos. And in this chaos, those who could make mistakes without stopping won, who could waste without suffering, who could improvise without losing power. The United States had become that power, not because of the genius of his generals, but because of the depth of his deposits. Not because of the perfection of its tanks, but because of the abundance of its axles. The tragedy of Nazi Germany was to discover, too late, that its war was artisanal, that its modernity was fragile, that its efficiency was powerless in the face of scale, and that in the end you cannot win an all-out war with partial resources. But there was something even more devastating for the Germans than seeing their doctrine fail. It was watching, helplessly, the transformation of the enemy into an organic system of war, a system that learned, corrected, expanded, and now began to apply the same logistical logics to all aspects of the conflict, including troop replacement, bridge engineering, and even medical evacuation. And as we will see below, this capacity for total adaptation was not accidental. It came from a hidden brain, hidden behind the lines, one that commanded the flow with mathematical precision, and that he was about to do something that the Germans thought impossible: accelerate even more. The German soldiers began to hear the sound of defeat before they even saw it. In the cold fields of occupied France, the silence of dawn was broken by a continuous, metallic, rhythmic rumble. They were engines, but not one or two. There were hundreds, coming from afar, advancing like a mechanical storm that did not cease. The sound of American Red Ball Express trucks crossed valleys, cut through forests, and seeped into trenches. There was no way to avoid it. He announced that while the Germans waited, the Americans were advancing. Each morning, that noise meant more ammunition in Patton's guns, more fuel in the tanks, more supplies, more men, more speed, and less hope. It was an auditory war, and the Germans were losing. Red Ball Express routes operated 24 hours a day. Trucks were ordered to keep headlights on, horns free, and engines running at constant speed. The idea was simple: never stop. But the side effect was devastating. American columns became living legends among German troops, not because of the weapons they carried, but because of the sound they produced. A sound that no European army had ever generated. A sound that conveyed more than a physical threat, a strategic certainty. You are surrounded by a force that never tires. Wehrmacht field reports began to describe what they called ghost trains. Soldiers swore they heard trucks approaching when no one was there. Officers noted complaints about nighttime noise even in unoccupied areas. Military psychologists, increasingly in demand, tried to explain the phenomenon: extreme fatigue, anxiety, sleep deprivation. But the soldiers did not believe it. They said that the sound came from the West, always from the West, and he always brought the same message: they are coming. This sound effect became a psychological weapon. The auditory presence of American logistics eroded German morale like a silent poison. It was a form of warfare that was not in the textbooks, but it worked. Because while the Americans used their trucks to supply the front, they also used their noise to occupy the enemy rear. Soldiers isolated in villages listened to the snoring for hours, not knowing if they were about to be attacked or just reminded that they were being overtaken. The contrast was brutal. The Germans, rationed with orders to save every gallon of fuel, now faced an army that burned gasoline as nonchalantly as it burned paper. A German driver, captured near Reims, recounted, "We walked in silence. They roared. Their sound said they were not afraid, and the silence reminded us that we had no way to react." The logic of American abundance transformed even noise into moral superiority. The engine became more effective than the speech, and the roar of the GMC CCKW replaced the artillery as a test of dominance. Moreover, the very shape of the trains contributed to the psychological collapse. Each Red Ball Express route ran in a closed loop: full round, empty round, continuous repetition. And this pattern created the sensation of an infinite flow. There were no breaks. There were no breathing windows. And the German soldiers, already exhausted, began to internalize the cycle as a sentence. They knew that if they survived the day, the sound would return at night, and the next day, again, and again, and again. The battlefront began to show clear symptoms of this wear and tear. German troops deserted in small groups, not from fighting, but from exhaustion. Officers with a history of unyielding discipline reported nervous breakdowns. Intercepted radiograms revealed veiled confessions between commanders. They are many. They never stop. It seems that the sky supplies them. The war, little by little, ceased to be a dispute for territory and became a dispute for moral resistance. And in this field, sound was overcoming silence. Even the occupying forces, which had previously relied on local superiority and knowledge of the terrain, began to lose the initiative. A report from the 17th SS Panzer Division detailed the situation in Nancy. "Every night we hear the same sound. We don't know how many there are, but we know they come. It's a war that looms while we sleep." The idea of an enemy always on the move, always replenished, always coming back, was more oppressive than any physical advance. The shadow of the Red Ball Express extended beyond geography. It took on the psychological. In response, the German High Command tried to silence fear with doctrine. Orders to destroy routes were intensified. Sabotage squads were given autonomy, but nothing worked. The routes changed. The Americans improvised detours, built bridges in 12 hours, created parallel routes with tractors. The sound continued, and with each blocking attempt, a new stretch appeared. It was like trying to stop a current with your hands. In the end, the sound of the Red Ball Express became more than a noise. It has become a symbol. Each truck heard from a distance was a reminder that the war was lost at its core. Because while Germany still depended on silences, on secrets, on ambushes, on calculated pauses, America won by making noise. A noise of industry, of improvisation, of excess. A noise that did not ask permission, and that, like history itself, could not be ignored. But there was something even more disturbing to come. Because if the Germans were already being defeated by the sound of American logistics, what would happen when they realized that the next advance would come not only from the land, but also from the sky? Inside a prison camp in the Ardennes, an exhausted and defeated Panzerwaffe colonel looked at the American interrogator and said in a tone that mixed incredulity and resignation, "They break all the rules, and they win." That phrase, accurately annotated by a Third Army intelligence officer, echoed more than a simple military observation. It was an ideological confession. The Red Ball Express had done more than supply divisions. He had dismantled a structure of belief. For the German officer, trained in the doctrine of order, precision, and central planning, the American victory was an anomaly. Improvised, noisy, redundant, and yet unstoppable. The German doctrine, inherited from Clausewitz and refined by generations of staff, did not include this type of war. Because she was not rational, it was volumetric. It was entropy, transformed into strategy. The paradigm shift began to manifest itself in repeated reports. Captured officers described the same feeling, a war with no apparent logic, but one that worked. An artillery major said, "They move like a factory on wheels. If one truck breaks down, another overtakes it. If one bridge explodes, they build another. It's like fighting against water." The image was accurate. The American force had no fixed center, no evident vulnerability. With each attempt to cut, the flow adapted. With each blocking attempt, a new solution emerged. It was as if American doctrine itself was the absence of doctrine, and that, for the German mind, trained in predictability, was unbearable. The Red Ball Express did not follow the campaign manuals. It did not obey the conventional limits of mobilization. The rules of the American army itself were defied for it to exist. The convoys violated military traffic regulations, ignored blackout zones, passed through ruined cities at more than 60 km/h, towing supplies at emergency speed. But the most impressive thing was that it worked, not by miracle, but because the American structure had been designed to tolerate error. And this is what broke the backbone of German logic. Because the Nazi machine was built on the illusion of absolute control. The American machine, on the other hand, was designed to fail and continue operating. The result was a philosophical transformation on the battlefield. It was no longer a question of which army had the best troop or the best tank. It was about which system survived its own chaos. And the United States, with its culture of mass production, standardization, and constant adaptation, won not in spite of the disorder, but through it. Disorganization was, paradoxically, the most effective weapon, and it shattered the German conviction that victory could only be born of perfect engineering. The Red Ball Express was the antithesis of the Blitzkrieg. Instead of strategy-driven speed, it was speed fueled by repetition. Instead of surgical movements, an avalanche of steel on wheels. Instead of precision, redundancy. And, in the end, effectiveness. The prisoners recounted the humiliation of seeing American columns passing through routes that the Germans had deemed impassable. Trucks traveling over makeshift bridges with trees, crossing cities without maps, dodging mines with hand-painted signs, and always arriving at the destination. A German engineering captain said, "They have no idea what they're doing, and for that very reason, they succeed." It was the revolt of the evidence, the emotional denial of a visible fact. The enemy did not need perfection. It just needed quantity and continuity. This paradigm shift generated a slow but devastating erosion of German morale. What began as contempt turned into perplexity, then frustration, and finally, psychological surrender. War is no longer a dispute over armaments. It became a collapse of meaning. Soldiers who had grown up hearing that technical efficiency was the supreme virtue now found themselves defeated by an enemy who seemed to operate by accident, but who had actually understood something bigger, that in the 20th century, power lay not in controlling the world, but in producing faster than it can be destroyed. The German faith in rational military science, in absolute planning, in tested doctrine, all this was dismantled by an improvised operation with more than 6,000 trucks running nonstop. The Red Ball Express didn't just destroy bridges. He shattered the illusion that the war could be won gracefully, because elegance gives way to reality when reality comes on wheels, with headlights on and horns on. And the American reality was simple. Winning was costly, and they could afford it. But as German generals struggled to accept this new logic, something even more surprising was brewing behind the scenes. Because what the Red Ball Express represented, this disorderly but efficient power, was not just a tactical model. It was a rehearsal for something even bigger, even more brutal, and that would redefine the very concept of mechanized warfare. And once again, the Germans were not ready for what came next. They didn't have medals, nor speeches, nor seats at the control desks, but they were on every mile of the road. They were the drivers of the Red Ball Express, men invisible on the map of war, but instrumental in every recorded victory. Mostly African Americans, segregated within the very army they defended. These soldiers drove day and night, guiding supply columns that kept Patton's blitz alive. They were not in the official photos. They did not march in parades, but they formed the backbone of the most powerful war machine ever built. His hands firmly on the wheel in rain, mud, and shelling carried more than fuel and ammunition. They carried the brutal paradox of a nation that, even though internally divided, managed to unite on the battlefield to crush the enemy that had erected segregation as a state ideology. The Red Ball Express was operating at full speed, with insane deadlines and non-existent margins of error. Each driver worked up to 20 hours a day. They slept in the seat of the truck. They ate cold food. And even so, they kept the trains moving. When the roads were bombed, they detoured. When bridges fell, they accelerated through improvised detours. And when one truck was hit, the others did not stop. They just dodged. It was a living line, fueled by courage and repetition. The newspapers of the time barely mentioned their names. The generals only saw the results. But on the muddy roads of France, these men were paving history itself. The irony was brutal. The Nazi regime, founded on racial supremacy, was defeated by trains driven by men who, in their own country, could not yet sit on the same benches as whites. American democracy, imperfect and contradictory, was overcoming racial totalitarianism with the very victims of inequality behind the wheel. These soldiers, despised in the rear, became the moral force of the front line, and without knowing it, they laid the foundations of a transformation that would come years later. The integration of the armed forces, the struggle for civil rights, the questioning of the very model that kept them on the sidelines. Among these drivers, a culture of their own has emerged. They painted nicknames on the windshields: Rollin' Thunder, Sweet Lorraine, Jim Crow Express, used slang, created their own codes, and developed bonds of loyalty that went beyond uniforms and ranks. Each truck carried not only cargo but also identity. In the midst of the chaos of war, there was a silent, emotional order. No one left anyone behind. Many died, not from direct combat, but from exhaustion, accidents, or ambushes. And yet, the trains did not stop. At each casualty, another driver took over, not for glory, but out of necessity. The American Army, at that time, still operated under official segregation. Separate barracks, separate commands, ignored merits. But in the crude logic of Red Ball Express, color meant nothing. What mattered was to deliver. It was arriving. It was to keep the blitz on. A white soldier, a survivor of a German attack, summed up the feeling years later. That black driver saved my life, and all I knew was that he drove as if the war depended on it. Because it depended. The contribution of these men was belatedly recognized. But in the countryside, on the soggy plains, and on the dangerous curves of the French front, they had already etched their name into history. Unknowingly, they were directing not only supplies to Paris, but also the first invisible march toward military equality. The integration of the armed forces, decreed in 1948 by Harry Truman, was not born of a signature. It was born in 1944, in the roar of GMC engines guided by black hands that defied statistics, bombs, and prejudice. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Men considered disposable by the system have proven to be irreplaceable at the critical hour. If you're enjoying unraveling these forgotten facts, where the strength of the story lies in the human details. Show your support. Like and subscribe. This is how we continue to bring light to the forgotten gears of victory. But even as these drivers won bravely and anonymously, there was something even more surprising brewing in the shadows of war. Because while the Germans were trying to understand the Red Ball Express through the logic of the front, a new dilemma arose where they least expected it. In the occupied cities themselves, where the defeated infrastructure was slowly beginning to work in favor of the invaders. The bridge over the Dives River in Normandy was not just a concrete and steel structure. It was a logistical bottleneck, one of the few crossing points capable of supporting the weight of the trucks that fed Patton's advance eastward. In September 1944, during the hasty retreat of the German 7th Armada, Wehrmacht engineers applied precision explosive charges, destroying the central pillars and sinking the main span. The strategy was simple: stop the flow. According to his calculations, no Allied force could repair it in less than 6 weeks. They knew the engineering doctrine of the European armies, and they knew that with the collapse of the bridge, the supply axis would be interrupted, and the offensive forced to retreat. But there was something the Germans had not foreseen: the absence of waiting. Less than 40 minutes after the explosion, American engineering teams were already on site. There was no meeting. There was no order coming from the high command. There was only the awareness that without that crossing, the Red Ball Express would stop. And stopping was not an option. Trucks were diverted along secondary routes, while the men of the 1106th Combat Engineer Battalion set up camp on the brink of destruction. The objective was only one: to build a temporary bridge that could withstand the weight of trains of up to 10 tons in record time. With Bailey modular structures, wooden planks, steel cables, and the help of tractors, cranes, and sheer manual power, they began construction. They worked in uninterrupted shifts. They illuminated the place with truck headlights. They cut down trees, laid foundations in the mud, and risked their lives amid unstable debris. The new bridge began to take shape in the early hours of the morning. At 7:15 a.m. the next morning, the first truck of the Red Ball Express crossed the crossing. The total time of stoppage of the logistics flow was only 14 hours. That bridge was not just an emergency structure. It was a manifesto, a symbol of the American operating philosophy. Don't plan for months, but act for minutes. German generals couldn't believe it when the reconnaissance reports came in. Aerial photographs showed the destroyed span, already covered by a new bridge. A German engineering commander recorded, "They do not respect natural limits. They just build on top." So the surprise was not only in the speed but in the audacity. The Germans projected the war as an equation, the Americans as a process. The Red Ball Express was the most extreme example of this mentality. At each obstacle, an improvised solution. With each destruction, a reconstruction. And with each attempt at interruption, a faster response than sabotage. The difference was not only in the technical capacity, but in the decentralization of the action. American engineering units had the autonomy to decide, act, and improvise without waiting for formal orders. This eliminated dead time. It was a war driven by initiative, not by hierarchy. The Dives Bridge episode has become an internal symbol among Red Ball drivers. Many passed through it without knowing that it had been built in less than a day, but everyone felt the difference. The line did not stop. The mission continued, and with that, the speed of the offensive was maintained. Patton's breakthrough was not only strategic, it was logistical. Every bridge erected, every road opened, every improvised detour, everything was part of a blitz not of tanks, but of solutions. While the Germans relied on destruction to slow down the enemy, the Americans relied on reconstruction to overcome it. The concept was simple but devastating in its effectiveness. Where the enemy saw an end, the American army saw a break, and this interval was always shorter than necessary. This philosophy of technical overcoming not only sustained the offensive, it accelerated it, because each failed blocking attempt increased the confidence of the trains, and each logistical victory amplified German despair. The Dives Bridge, made of modular steel and stubbornness, would continue to work for weeks. But its impact was not just physical, it was psychological. German forces began to realize that the enemy could no longer be slowed down by traditional means, because what they were facing wasn't just an army, it was a culture that did not accept paralysis, that he did not recognize obstacles, that transformed difficulty into schedule. And so, instead of limiting the Allied advance, The destruction of the bridge became the portrait of German impotence in the face of a force that did not respect the rhythms of conventional warfare. Time, which had always been an ally of the strategist, had changed sides. Now it was the weapon of those who moved faster. But if the Germans believed that the Red Ball Express was the pinnacle of American logistical power, they had not yet seen it all. Because, in the shadow of road success, a second supply line was beginning to be born. One that didn't use wheels. It used rails. And that promised to multiply the pace of the offensive in a way that not even the Americans dared to foresee. George S. Patton believed in war as an act of movement. A constant, brutal, uninterrupted advance. His doctrine was speed, not out of vanity but out of military principle. A fast-moving army destabilizes the enemy, breaks defenses before they form, confuses the command before it reacts. But in September 1944, even the most aggressive general in the European theater had to stop, not because of will, but because of lack of gasoline. Their tanks, victorious, were empty. And in that enforced silence, Patton saw what he had previously ignored. The war was no longer won in the barrel of the cannon. It was won in the fuel tank. He began to visit the supply areas. I watched trucks arrive covered in mud, exhausted men coming out of the cab, maps scribbled with improvised shortcuts. He found that many of those drivers hadn't slept for 2 days, who drove without an escort, on poorly marked roads, under bombardment and fog. And even so, they delivered. They delivered because they knew that if they failed, the entire Third Army would stop. In one of his rare confessions, Patton wrote, "These drivers, they drive to the brink of insanity, but keep the war alive. They are more lethal than my divisions." The Red Ball Express didn't just sustain their advance. It redefined his conception of power. The general who built his reputation on bravery and impulsiveness came to understand the importance of quiet persistence, the heroism of the midfielder, the sacrifice without a headline. Patton began asking for logistical reports with the same interest he had previously intended for offensive maps, and when he spoke to his officers, he no longer praised only the gunners or armored vehicles. It started to include drivers, the mechanics, the engineers, because he understood that his blitz was not only made of steel, it was made of grease, diesel, and rotation of axles. This recognition echoed through the army. Infantry units began escorting convoys voluntarily. Officers, previously distant, began to organize more structured rest points. The Red Ball Express is no longer just an operation. It has become a symbol, a reminder that no tactic survives without supply, that no victory resists the emptiness of the tank. And above all, that modern warfare was a symphony of logistics, where every note counted, and the rear was the invisible conductor. Patton was not a man of emotional speeches, but he recognized merit when he saw it. On a visit to the supply line, he saw a convoy with the windshield painted with the phrase, "Born to run, trained to win." He smiled, climbed on the footboard, and greeted the driver. "You're winning this war more than you realize." The man, an African American, tired, just nodded. At that moment, two philosophies met, the glory of the front and the burden of the rear. And Patton, the general of the lightning offensive, finally saw the full line of combat. This recognition even transformed the way the Third Army operated. Orders began to consider distances more accurately. The targets were adjusted to the actual capacity of the trains, and new routes began to be protected as a priority, because now they knew that without a road, without axles, without men at the wheel, there was no blitz. There was static, and static was death. The Red Ball Express revealed to the American command something greater than efficiency. It revealed interdependence. Victory was no longer a sequence of battles won, but a continuous line of well-sustained supplies. The front had extended backwards, and Patton, more than anyone, knew how to see this, not with speeches, but with silent respect, and with the certainty that his war was no longer his. It belonged to all those who moved it. But while Patton recognized the value of the rear guard, a new movement emerged beyond the roads, because even with the Red Ball Express in maximum operation, demand grew. The tanks were advancing faster than any route could sustain, and the inevitable question arose in the high command: how to supply a war that consumes more than any road can deliver. The answer was on track, and it was about to bend the logic of logistics once again. Warfare had been taught for centuries as an art of maneuver, tactics, and command. Generals studied Hannibal, Napoleon, Clausewitz, but in 1944, As the engines of the Red Ball Express roared across the devastated roads of France, a new doctrine emerged, not written into military treaties, but stamped on the tires of 6,000 trucks. Logistics was no longer the backstage of the war. It was the war itself. Each surrender was an act of combat. Every gallon poured into Patton's tanks was a statement of supremacy, not ideological, but industrial. The Red Ball Express transported 412,000 tons of supplies in 81 days. Food, ammunition, medicine, fuel. It wasn't an operation. It was an ecosystem in motion. While the Germans counted tanks and distributed rationed ammunition with surgical precision, the Americans flooded the theater of operations with excess. Where a German tank took days to receive bespoke parts, a Sherman tank swapped components as if changing tires. Standardization, scale, volume. The doctrine of war had been replaced by a philosophy of production. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity. Courage is not enough. Discipline does not guarantee victory. Technology without replacement is an illusion. Germany lost not because its soldiers were less brave, but because its factories were less free. They fought with artisanal perfection against an enemy that operated like an assembly line. And this line did not stop, not even at night, not even in the rain, nor with losses. The concept of failure was absorbed by the system. The error was predicted. The replacement was automatic. Abundance replaced precision as the engine of victory. This is where history turns into philosophical revelation. Because the Red Ball Express wasn't just a feat of military engineering, it was the manifestation of an entire society. Each driver represented not only a battalion, but a model of civilization. A civilization where improvisation, mobility, and productivity were worth more than rigidity, hierarchy, and technical idealism. War has ceased to be an arena of strategy to become an extension of the factory, and the factory in this new world was the source of power. The German command began to grasp this change too late. When they looked at the maps and saw the American fronts moving with impossible speed, they already knew that they were not facing just one army. They faced a self-sufficient, uninterrupted supply chain capable of regenerating their strength on a daily basis. Time, which used to favor those who knew how to wait, now favored those who knew how to produce. Waiting has become a weakness. Scarcity, a sentence. The elegance of the doctrine gave way to the brutality of the surrender. At the end of the campaign in France, a Wehrmacht report used the word indestructible to describe American logistical capability, but the term was wrong. It was not invulnerability. It was resilience. It was the strength of a system built not to last, but to continue. The Germans still operated as if the war were a duel between arms. The Americans had already understood. It was a duel between industrial ecosystems. The Red Ball Express revealed to the 20th century that industrial intelligence was the new strategic weapon. It was not enough to win battles. It was necessary to sustain victories. It was not enough to have brilliant generals. It was necessary to have disciplined workers, practical engineers, tireless drivers. Victory was born in the factories of Detroit. It was shaped in the Ford workshops, packaged by civilians and delivered by young people who would never see the front, but would sustain its existence. This transformation was universal. In the coming Cold War, armies would be networks. Fleets would be logistics chains. Geopolitics would change from trench to port, from fortress to warehouse. Because after the Red Ball Express, no serious general would dare ignore the rear. No future strategy would be built without thinking about inventory. No combat doctrine would survive without including the assembly line as part of the offensive. But for this new era to have a full impact, the story had to be told. That the world would understand why Germany fell, not for American bravery, but for its ability to put more wheels, more boxes, more fuel, more parts, in the right place, at the right time, every day. The Red Ball Express was not a miracle. It was the inevitable effect of a civilization that transformed production into a method of war. And as the generals of the Third Reich revised their calculations for the last time, trying to find some logic in the collapse, one phrase echoed between the lines of history. The Americans didn't break the rules. They rewrote the playbook. And now, it was no longer possible to win without understanding why a convoy is worth more than an armored division. The final question was no longer who had the most tanks, but who could feed them, every day, non-stop. And if there was still any doubt, the next issue would end the discussion. Because while the Wehrmacht mobilized 600 tanks across the Western Front, the United States kept 6,000 trucks active, just for a single supply line. This was the new arithmetic of war. And in the end, it wasn't the spear that beat the shield. It was the factory mat that won the battlefield. On November 16, 1944, the last convoy of the Red Ball Express crossed the supply line toward the front line. By this time, Patton's offensive had already exceeded the limits envisaged by any military manual. Germany, which had bet on American logistical bankruptcy as inevitable, had watched, in silence, the collapse of its own doctrine. It was not the destruction of a city, nor the loss of a general that marked the end of that belief. It was the realization that a system powered by wheels, relays, and 20-hour shifts had defeated German calculation, hierarchy, and engineering. In that war, the engine won over the method, improvisation won out over rigor, and quantity won out over accuracy. The Red Ball Express proved with noise and dust that war does not belong to the most daring, nor to the most disciplined. It belongs to the one who can move more, faster, for longer. Logistics is no longer an operational detail. It has become the essence of strategy. The American victory was not won with tanks alone. It was supported by axles, trucks, grease, anonymous arms, and silent faith. And the world has learned that, in the 20th century, you don't win by the best plan, but by the greatest production. German perfection collapsed in the face of American persistence. And in that scenario of ruins and lit headlights, history has redefined its formula of power. To win is to fuel. A German general captured near Liège muttered at the sight of the road lit up by endless American convoys, "We never prepared for this." It was more than a phrase of surrender. It was an ideological confession. The enemy had not lost to a better armed force. It had lost to a better supplied enemy. And if you believe that history is written in the details, help this channel to continue digging for the hidden truths. Like, subscribe, and activate the bell. This keeps alive the mission of telling what the manuals ignore. And comment. What was the most unbelievable fact of this journey? The number of trucks? The sound of engines beating morale? The assembly line that defeated the front line? Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.